Well, Grace Jackson joins us in England, Great Britain. She is
That's
co
right.
host of the Literary Hangover podcast, and she's an expert on history and fiction, as well as China. Welcome back, Grace Jackson.
Thank you. Hi, it's good to be back. I have emerged from my winter hibernation.
Where your
Um,
heart beats only 8 times a minute, as I understand.
yeah, something like that. That sounds about right. Although my heart rate is somewhat elevated right now.
Well, there's a lot going on. Let's talk about the Russian invasion of Ukraine and how
Mm,
that affects Russia's relationship with China, America's relationship with China, and Ukraine's relationship with China.
mm, yes, this is a very interesting question. Um, and it's something that I've been thinking about a lot lately. So China in all of this is it's kind of got quite a delicate balancing act that it needs to maintain. And that is because, and I'm sure that many of your listeners are aware of all of these dynamics, but obviously China and Russia, particularly since I'd say the mid 2000s, and especially since the Crimean crisis in 2014, have been kind of converging somewhat in terms of their strategic interests, and their relationship has been getting stronger. And that's all culminated recently. There have been some meetings. I think there was a meeting around the Winter Olympics in Beijing that happened just before the invasion, where they declared their relationship to be rock solid, that there were no limits on this relationship between Xi Jinping and Vladimir Putin. And that is obviously, now that Russia has invaded Ukraine, that is posing a few challenges, I would say, rhetorically for China. Um, and this is partly because China, in its own kind of identity on the world stage and diplomatically, China has really been committed to projecting an image of itself as a non-interventionist power, right? China wants to uphold, to take the moral high ground, especially vis-a-vis America, and especially in the wake of the disastrous interventions in Iraq and Afghanistan, those nasty NATO wars, that I thought we'd seen the back of. But so it's very important for China to kind of have that moral high ground. At the same time, China has refused to actually outright condemn Russia for invading Ukraine. And domestically in Chinese media, um, the Chinese media are not describing this as a war of aggression. They are using Moscow's language, which is that this is a military operation. Maybe it's a conflict, but it's not a war of aggression. Um, and so it's walking this fine line. There are some rumors that have kind of come out of some leaks in the European Union that Russia has asked China for military aid. The Chinese ambassador has denied this, has called it disinformation. I would be inclined to believe him on that, because at this stage there's very little. I can't imagine that Russia would actually need China's military aid at this point. Um, so yeah, those are the basic dynamics, but kind of underlying those dynamics, there's a very interesting history of a sort of a nationalism in both countries, in both Russia and China, that is shaped by a narrative of historical grievance.
Right.
Um, and in China, that is extremely important to the Communist Party's kind of um, maintenance of power. I would say, there's this sense in which China endured a century of humiliation at the hands of the West. And this is all kind of beginning with the Opium Wars, when the West opened up China by force to free trade. So opened its markets coercively. And similarly in Russia, I think we've seen in Vladimir Putin's that grievance speech he gave right at the beginning of the invasion, the one that was, it was so, you could see it was very sincere. I mean, it was scary, it was very bitter, but I think that historical grievance, similarly potent, but it's much later in provenance. So it's thinking about the collapse of the Soviet Union, the expansion of NATO, and all those themes that we're very familiar with. But it was just interesting for me because I recognized a very similar tone to the way that China, Beijing, talks about, for example, Taiwan or Xinjiang or Tibet. There is this commitment to territorial integrity and sovereignty that is connected to the anxiety of thinking about what happened in the 19th century when China says it was cut up like a melon by the imperialist powers. Incidentally, Russia was among those powers back in the 19th century, but no longer. The world has moved on. And so, yeah, those are the sort of basic contours that I see.
Right. I'm just kind of curious. So we were taught that Dick Morris, the toe sucker, taught Bill Clinton how to triangulate to turn the Democrats against the Republicans so Bill Clinton could get reelected. And we were taught that he learned that from Henry Kissinger, who triangulated Russia, America, and China, that the trip to China that Nixon took was really a poke in the eye to Russia to stir up trouble between Russia and China. Is that true? Did we create tensions between Russia and China? Have there been military tensions? Have there been little battles in the 20th century? Border skirmishes between Russia and China that we exacerbate?
I mean, there was the Sino-Soviet split that occurred in the late 1950s, early 1960s. That was quite serious. But I think when you mention Kissinger and that sort of triangulation idea, I think that is actually still very relevant. And I believe that from the perspective of somebody like Kissinger, the current conflict is really interesting because actually I think Kissinger would say China and the US need to be closer, that he would probably advocate for, I'm not sure if he would advocate this, but perhaps he would advocate for more kind of conciliation of China by the US, precisely because of this threat from a unified Russia and China. You know, that is a really serious proposition for US hegemony. And I feel like Kissinger has the long view of that, you know, for all of his kind of, for all of the things that he has wrought in the world, which I would certainly never defend.
What does China have in Ukraine? What does Russia have in Ukraine? What does America have in Ukraine? What do we want from Ukraine?
Oof.
What's there?
I wouldn't say that China wants anything from Ukraine specifically. I'd say that what China wants is to kind of uphold its own interests geopolitically, which, like I said at the beginning, it's more a question of China's sort of somewhat antagonistic relationship towards the unipolar, the kind of American-led world order. I wouldn't say there are kind of concrete resources, although I'm not familiar with those aspects of Ukraine. I think in terms of what the US wants, I would say the US wants to basically not be a declining power in the world. And interestingly, I think, and I'm certainly not the first person to say this, I think Vladimir Putin's decision to invade Ukraine is actually only going to strengthen the forces that he feels threatened by. You know, the West is going to be more unified than ever. NATO is going to be strengthened by all of this. And I think that is what the US wants. And I think the US has a strategic interest in arming the Ukrainians, in ensuring that this conflict does play out and that it doesn't get resolved quickly, diplomatically, with an agreement. And I think, by the way, that Taiwan needs to be considered in all of this.
Yeah.
I think too much has been made of the parallel between Ukraine and Taiwan. Ukraine is not Taiwan. Taiwan is not Ukraine. There are so many differences in, their economies, the nature of their states, the maturity of their states. But I do think that it's sort of the elephant in the room, and China obviously has a huge interest in Taiwan not declaring independence. But I think, for what it's worth, the US actually has more of an interest in Taiwan than it does in Ukraine. And I think if China were to ever invade Taiwan, the US would do more than it's doing right now with Ukraine.
Why?
If that makes sense.
Why?
Because Taiwan is way more strategically important to the US than Ukraine is, I believe. Partly because if you look at the Taiwanese economy, it's a mainstay of semiconductor manufacturing. That's one reason. Look at its location. It's a very strategically placed island that kind of straddles a lot of shipping routes. It's a kind of connection to Japan as well, if you kind of go further up the chain of islands. There are just lots of reasons why Taiwan is very important to the US and always has been. And there are some very interesting differences too with Ukraine.
Yeah. When Biden first took office, Blinken and Biden's national security advisor and Jen Psaki were all saying it's only a matter of time before China makes a move on Taiwan. Do you see that happening? Do you see, we've been told, if you watch certain television networks, they'll say, well, how we respond to Ukraine signals to China how we're going to respond to their invasion of Taiwan. You said the response will be different. This Ukraine thing is not a leading indicator of our pivot to the Pacific.
No, I don't think it is. But I also don't agree with Blinken. And I don't think that, China is imminently going to invade Taiwan. In fact, I think in the past year or so, maybe 2 years, we've actually seen a little bit of a cooling off of the rhetoric coming out of Beijing. So, for example, last year there was a very important meeting of the Chinese Communist Party where they issued their third ever historical resolution. This is basically something that happens every few decades in China, where the party gets together and it actually talks about its own history. And then it releases a statement saying, well, what's happened in the past 20 years or so is this, this, and this. And there's only ever been two before. I think there was one in 1949 and one in 1981. And interestingly, last year, whereas you might have expected there to be a lot of kind of belligerence towards Taiwan in that statement, I've got a quote here. It said that time and momentum are always on our side for the complete reunification of the motherland. And what that suggests to me is that actually China is still content to play the long game when it comes to Taiwan. It's not about to do anything rash. Plus the fact that the Chinese economy has slowed a little bit. It may slow a little bit more this year, and that's always a huge source of legitimacy for the party, right? In a country where, you don't vote for the government, the state of the economy is a huge, huge issue. I mean, it's a huge issue for every country, but especially in China, if that begins to slip, I think you'll see that they'll kind of recalibrate the intensity of their rhetoric on Taiwan. And I don't think an invasion is imminent, thankfully.
Right.
But I think the US would do more than it's been doing with Ukraine. And that could get obviously really ugly and really scary quite quickly.
I was living in San Francisco in 1989. I think it was 1989 when Prince Charles turned over the keys to China, gave Hong Kong, I think it was 89 where he gave Hong Kong to China.
97 was the official handover,
Okay.
but 89 they might have like scheduled it then or agreed it then.
Maybe he gave them the keys to the storage facility, like you can start putting stuff in the storage facility.
This
And
is just an excuse for you to mention the monarchy. I see
that's
this.
right. That's right. So there was a flood of people leaving Hong Kong, coming to America, fearing communism. Many stayed behind. Hong Kong flourished. We were convinced that it was a country all to its own, that China would never mess with Hong Kong because its economy, I think, was bigger than all of China's. I think it was, and for them to change it would blow up in their face.
Mm.
Have the fears of the people who left Hong Kong come to fruition? Were they right for leaving Hong Kong? In your estimation, has it become dangerous for the capitalists left behind?
That's two different questions. I think it has not become dangerous for the capitalists left behind, but I'm not going to say whether they were right or wrong to leave, but I think Hong Kong has been transformed in the past 3 years, and this is one of the major kind of like, it's something that partly because of COVID, we haven't really kept our eye on, I think. But Hong Kong is a completely different place.
The umbrella revolution? Is that what they?
Right. Well, that happened back in 2014, the umbrella movement. That was a kind of student uprising. People are going to tell me that it was actually an NED funded imperialist,
What's NED?
Or whatever. National Endowment for Democracy. There's a widespread belief in certain parts of the left that the Hong Kong independence movement, which does exist, has been largely manufactured and funded by the US. And I don't really want to get into that because it's such a kind of, people get really, really upset. Right. And I also sometimes get upset, but in any case, Hong Kong has been transformed by the national security law, which was passed by China a couple of years ago. And I think that, it's interesting, you mentioned that people thought China was never going to interfere with Hong Kong. Well, the date that was given for the current kind of status quo to be maintained was until 2047, right? So in 2047, the current status quo, which is referred to as one country with two systems, so Hong Kong and China being one country but enjoying two systems, so that Hong Kong can have sort of limited democracy, certain kind of free markets, etc., that could be maintained. And one of the kind of distinctive characteristics of Hong Kong, which is a legacy of British imperialism, is that it does have this kind of legal culture. And some would say it had a pretty robust rule of law, guaranteed by the courts, independent courts. That stuff is disappearing. And yet, David, I think it is still very much a safe place for capitalists.
So I asked you a question that belied my brainwashing. We were always told that capitalism can't exist without democracy. We always portray the communists in China and Russia as being against democracy. Could Hong Kong be a bastion of capitalism where people don't vote, where people have no say in their destiny?
I think some people would argue that China is already that mainland China is, in fact, in some respects, a bastion of capitalism where people don't.
So capitalism and democracy are not synonymous. Is that what you're telling?
Who could believe it?
I'd also point out that most capitalist countries throughout history haven't been especially democratic, and in a great many cases, not democratic at all.
Right. Let me bring in Professor Ben Burgis, and hopefully Grace can stick around. I'm going to ask you a question, Grace, that I think Professor Ben Burgis would want to answer. Professor Ben Burgess, this conversation that we're having with Grace about capitalism, democracy, and empire. I keep hearing that America is terrified that we're losing our grip on the world. But I don't feel like we're an empire. I don't feel like I'm the beneficiary of an empire. I don't have, carts of gold landing in my feet. The price of nutmeg hasn't gone down. So what does it mean? You're living in Great Britain, Grace. Did you know that? You live in Great Britain?
No, hadn't the foggiest.
I'm good at geography. So is empire a psychological
State
thing?
of mind, yes.
State of mind?
Well, look, I think empire, that's not how empires work. Empires don't create wealth for the David Feldmans and the Grace Jacksons of this world, especially when they're run by oligarchs. So I think that's all by design, feature, not bug. But if you want to talk about declining powers, yes, I am currently living in the bosom of, I would say, the world's most advanced and rapidly declining power. So I can really speak from my lived experience in that regard.
And yet it houses all the oligarchs. All the Russian oligarchs come to London. So the money, the money, Great Britain has retained all the money that comes with empire, but they don't need any more. They don't need as big a navy to enforce the empire.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, I think
pretty smart, if you ask me.
Really? Well,
I'd point out that if at the height of the British Empire, when they did have the big navy, read some Charles Dickens novels, it didn't particularly benefit most ordinary people. Or at the height of the Roman Empire, most people in Rome lived on some pretty meager daily bread rations. That's
right.
It's not. I just to underline and circle Grace's point about how that's not typically how empires work.
But it seems to me the British have figured something out. Instead of looting a country of its rubber, just loot it of its cash reserves. Just take their money, mine their money, mine their generals and their leaders.
Yeah, well, I think, like, just to give credit to the chat here, and I have become distracted by the chat in the past few minutes, but
never happened before.
As as Lane points out, the City of London is not Great Britain. The City of London is the City of London, and it is the financial capital of the world still. And it's where all of that, it's ground zero for kind of all the privatization, the financialization of the economy that we saw under Reagan and Thatcher. And I think what you see now is this kind of encrustation of empire, where we do have this outsized financial role. But truly, David, I mean, I want to emphasize most people in the UK right now are suffering with the biggest cost of living crisis in a generation.
It's the Democrats in this country. It was the stimulus bill giving $300 a month to kids here in America. It caused inflation all over the world.
Yeah, well,
Professor, we love having you on the show. We love having Ben Burgess on the show. And